dashing dogwoods out there. Welcome to another episode of A Little Greener, a podcast all about conservation, sustainability, and nature. I am one of your hosts, Casey, and I am joined by the wonderful Sara. Hello, Sara.
Hello, Casey. Happy Earth Month, Casey.
Happy Earth Month, Earth Week, Earth Day that we missed belatedly.
We missed it all. Happy third anniversary to A Little Greener. I can't believe we've been doing this for 3 years, but I'm so proud of us and so glad that we're still doing it.
If you heard that sound, it was me patting myself on the back and you too virtually because we did it. And we're back with another episode.
Yeah, it may actually not be Earth Month anymore, actually, by the time this episode comes out. I just realized. So sorry that we got through the whole month of April without mentioning it, but it's okay because Earth Day is every day. And Thank you for tuning in and listening to A Little Greener for the past 3 years, for those of you who have been there with us for that long. And if you haven't, hey, you've got a whole bunch of backlogged episodes that you can catch up on.
Yeah, we have like over 100 episodes. And also, if you're enjoying your time with us, this is going to be one of our few times that we plug the whole rate review on whatever platform you listen to, because it helps other people find our podcast. Recommend it to a friend. An individual episode, if it comes up in conversation, the topic, we've got lots of topics going out there. Sara, what is our special topic for today's episode?
I'm so excited about today's episode. So if you've been listening to the pod, you know most of the time that it's Casey and I chatting about a topic of our choosing that we research ourselves. But every once in a while, we do love to welcome special guests onto the pod. And that is what we are doing this week. Casey and I had the chance to talk to Mr. Jeffrey Rissman, who I don't even know how to describe his job.
Sara will go through a very formal introduction when you start to hear the interview. Just know that he's a very impressive person, and Sara has been geeking out over all the stuff that we've been learning from him just by reading his book and things.
I really have. Yeah, he's such a smart person, and I think that he's contributed so much to the industry that he's working in, which is largely about how to clean up the industrial sector. So he was on the podcast right now because he has written a book that came out recently called Zero Carbon Industry. So Casey and I are in the process of working our way through this book. I really do recommend it, even if you're not somebody who knows a lot about the industrial sector or how that works. He does a really nice job of laying everything out. So we're very fortunate to get a chance to talk with him. You'll hear a little bit more about the work that he's done in the actual episode.
I think the cool thing is, if you are looking for people who are doing the actual work of figuring out how to save our planet, Jeffrey Rissman is one of those people. And so it's very cool to be able to talk to someone who's really doing some of the work to help solve this huge crisis that's facing us all. So we left the conversation, I think, feeling pretty hopeful and optimistic and learned a whole lot. So we really hope that you will enjoy our interview with Mr. Jeffrey Rissman.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this very special episode of A Little Greener. We are very excited today to welcome our guest, Mr. Jeffrey Rissman. Jeffrey does so many things, so you can jump in and correct. I'm going to start listing some things off. Correct me, Jeffrey, if I say anything out of line here. But your job, your title, you are the Senior Director of Industry at Energy Innovation, which is described as a nonpartisan energy and environmental policy firm. You do research and analysis that you provide to policymakers, which helps them to make informed choices on energy policy, which is amazing. You are also the creator of the Energy Policy Simulator, which is an open source computer model that this is probably overly simplifying it, but it lets you look at the impacts of different energy and environmental policies. We're going to ask you about this in a little bit, Jeffrey, because I think that it is amazing. And also, very pertinent to today's discussion, you are also the author of a book that just came out not too long ago called Zero Carbon Industry: Transformative Technologies and Policies to Achieve Sustainable Prosperity. So welcome to A Little Greener, Jeffrey. We are so happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Sarah and Casey. Thank you so much for having me on the show. And yeah, you got the no corrections needed. You got the long list right.
I mean, there's
So
more. I know that you serve as an advisor for the government as well, and all kinds of amazing things. So hopefully, we'll get into some of those things a little bit. And actually, that's kind of where we'd love to start. We've given you a little bit of an introduction here, but would you mind sharing just a little bit more about yourself? How did you get interested in environmental issues, and in particular, looking at the industrial sector as it relates to the environment? How did you wind up here?
sure. So as far as environmental issues broadly, it was something I was looking at. I had decided I wanted to work in this field after I completed my undergrad degree. And so I was thinking of choosing a graduate program that would give me a way to work on something involving, I wanted to solve an important problem facing people where it had science and policy, and I could combine those things. So I thought maybe I'd go into sustainable planning or something. So I got an urban planning degree with a focus on environmental planning, and also an environmental engineering degree for more technical background. But then where I sort of ended up was at this think tank, Energy Innovation, where the focus is on mitigating dangerous climate change, so stopping greenhouse gas emissions. And the energy policy simulator you mentioned was one of my largest projects, or one of my two big ones, along with the book. And it was really part of that work that got me interested in the industry sector, because that simulator tool covers all sectors of the economy, meaning transportation and buildings and in industry and land use and agriculture and electric power. And then we made versions of it, adaptations of it for many different countries and regions around the world. And in place after place, I was seeing the industrial sector is a huge chunk of the total emissions. And yet policy, like there are fewer policies targeted at it, and the ones that there were weaker or didn't address the emissions as much. It was really getting much too little attention. And so I proposed starting this industry program within our firm and leading it in order to help better educate policymakers, decision makers, media, everyone about how you can go about really transition to clean industry.
That's a great jumping off point into talking about this book here. We are still working through it ourselves because there's a lot of really good information in there. Who did you have in mind when you're laying out this roadmap? Obviously, like coming from this kind of big range of topics having to do with industry, which can be kind of inscrutable for the average person. Are you hoping that like every politician picks this up, or are you hoping that, anybody going through the airport or who has an interest in this, do you think this is an accessible topic for them? Like, who did you have in mind when you were writing for it?
Yeah. So the goal of the book is to make this an accessible topic for anyone who has, I mean, it assumes at least a little background knowledge. Like, it doesn't say what is climate change, but it doesn't assume any knowledge of the industrial sector. And by industrial sector, I mean all the firms that make all the materials and products we rely on every day, like steel or cement or plastics and chemical products and so on. So I think that it has been somewhat inscrutable, and that's too bad, because there are so many exciting technologies now that can allow us to produce all of these goods and materials we rely on without greenhouse gas or other pollutant emissions. And I think because people don't see it every day, you ride in your car every day, you think about transport, you're in your house every day, you think about buildings and insulation and heating and cooling, but you don't see where cement is manufactured. And so I really wanted, so I think this book could be, essential reading for anyone who wants to understand this industrial sector. It really breaks it down. It shows what these processes are and how they use energy, where the emissions come from, and how you can achieve all of the production we need without those emissions. So it's this anyone who's interested, and I certainly would love it if every politician had one, because that would be great. But it isn't just for politicians and it isn't just for engineers or something. It's for anyone who really wants to understand this important but neglected sector.
Well, I will back that up because, as Casey said, we have not, unfortunately, been able to finish the book yet, just due to life getting in the way. But as skimming through it, as someone who falls very much in that field, who obviously has an interest and some background in environmental issues, but certainly not formally educated or part of the industry in any way, I have thoroughly enjoyed how you have laid out this book. And I think, Casey, I was talking to you about it earlier, how it was just so nice that you really do start from the beginning. So you sort of take a look at here's how this works. Here's how these things are made right now. Here are some things that we could tweak a little bit to make them better now. But then here's what we need to do to take that big step forward as we move towards actual zero carbon industry. So I think you've achieved your goal there. So for listeners out there who may be thinking, well, I don't know anything about industry, this is a good read for you because it helps you understand the process before it asks you to think about how to change it. And I do really like that. With all of that being said, I think from the outside looking in, this idea of making industry zero carbon seems like such a giant task. It feels almost impossible, I think, when you think about the carbon emissions that come from the industrial sector today. So can you break it down for us a little bit, assuming somebody who does not have a great deal of knowledge, what are the biggest contributors in the industrial sector to our greenhouse gas emissions? What are like the big target areas that we need to work on, would you say?
Sure. I'm really happy you liked the book. So the book breaks down the industrial sector in a way that tries to make it very comprehensible and understandable. Although there are many millions of type of products that industry produces with lots of industrial processes, the problem of decarbonizing industry doesn't have to be overly complex. And that's partly because there's a lot of consolidation of the emissions into a few industries. The top three are the steel industry, the chemicals industry, whose main output products are fertilizers and plastics, and then the cement and other non-metallic minerals, predominantly cement, which is the binder in concrete. Concrete is a mixture of little crushed up rocks and sand and cement to hold it all together. So together, those three are about 60% of global industrial emissions. And there's a long tail of other industries that have some emissions, but fortunately, there's a lot of cross-cutting technologies that can decarbonize many different industries, the same technology. For instance, the book spends some time talking about energy efficiency, material efficiency, and electrification of industrial heating, all of which apply very broadly to many or all industries. So you don't need a special customized program or policy or set of technologies to address every single small industry. Some customization makes sense for the top three big industries and perhaps in certain other specific cases. But for the most part, the cross-cutting technologies can deal with the long tail of smaller industries.
That's certainly encouraging that there's definitely some commonalities between these big industries and how we can solve these problems. We've actually done an episode about cement production on our podcast. We were lucky to talk to Justin Gillis, who wrote The Big Fix, and did a little bit of a deep dive on that as one of our topics. And one of the things that we talked about during that is that it seems difficult to get to zero carbon emissions out of that without maybe some carbon capture technology. Do you think that that's the right read on that particular industry? And if so, like what do you see as the future for carbon capture? Some folks have some drawbacks about how expensive it is. Is it a cop out to just continuing to produce materials without thinking about the long-term effects? What are your thoughts?
Good question. Yeah, carbon capture can be divisive. One chapter in my book is devoted to it, where I try to look at it carefully in a very balanced way and figure out where is the niche where carbon capture makes sense and where would other technologies be the first best options. So for background, for any listeners, carbon capture is about storing the CO2 typically underground, though there's also some who propose using it in products, but for the most part, it means storing it underground. And one of the downsides of carbon capture is that it increases fossil fuel consumption rather than decreasing it. And there's upstream emissions associated with fossil fuel production. For example, methane, the main component of natural gas, leaks from natural gas wells and from coal mines, coal mine methane. So as long as those extraction activities are going on, there still will be some upstream methane leakage, even if you were to capture 100% of the CO2 where the fuel is being combusted. Cement making is something of a special case because most of its CO2 is not from the burning of fossil fuels. About 60% comes from the breakdown of limestone, which is calcium carbonate rock, to form clinker, the main ingredient in cement, and CO2. And so this carbon, even if you electrify the heat for the cement kiln and you're not burning any fossil fuels, you'll still have that 60% of CO2 emissions from the rock. So there are ways to address this. You can lower it through material efficiency. You can use supplementary materials or alternative cement chemistries potentially, but there are certain drawbacks involved. For instance, some of the alternative chemistry cements may not protect steel reinforcements inside them from corrosion, or they might not sequester CO2. Normal concrete does in a process called carbonation over decades while it's in service, but if it's cured with CO2 at the time it's put into service, it might not take up CO2 later, so you have to account for that. In the end, I think that there is a role for carbon capture here, to capture the CO2 from the limestone breakdown where the alternatives are not very technologically mature and have their own potential drawbacks, although perhaps in the longer term, there may be some of these alternative chemistries or alternative source materials, carbon-free minerals, will capture some share of the market as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Carbon capture. One of the reasons that I was so excited to have you on was to ask that specific question, because it just seems difficult sometimes to find unbiased information about carbon capture and to really kind of siphon out what its potential actually is versus the drawback. So thank you for that. Like Casey mentioned, we have talked a little bit about the cement and concrete industry on the podcast before. Something that we haven't really delved into too much, so I was interested to read about in your book, is the chemicals, the chemical aspect of industry. And in the book, you mention that the chemical industry is a little bit different, again, in terms of those fossil fuels, where a lot of times we do talk about the burning of fossil fuels as being the issue that we need to address. But with chemicals, fossil fuels are used as feedstocks, and only about 30% are burned for energy. So can you maybe again explain to the layperson what that means. What are chemical feedstocks, and what would you say is the alternative then as we work towards zero carbon industry?
Absolutely. So feedstock fossil fuels are chemically like other fossil fuels. They're coal or natural gas or petroleum-based fuels. The difference is how they're used. So typically, in most cases, fossil fuels are burned for energy, such as heat or to run a motor. But feedstock fossil fuels are chemically transformed through reactions to make up part of the output products. So, for example, the petroleum fuels are often turned into petrochemicals like ethylene and propylene, which then go on to be turned into end products like polyethylene or polypropylene plastic, which then is made into things. Similarly, with fertilizers, they come from ammonia, which comes from natural gas. And one of the important differences here then is if what you're doing is burning a fossil fuel for energy, typically heat, you might be able to replace it with electricity. Use electricity directly, clean electricity from renewable resources, and create the heat that way. But if you are using the fossil fuel to make up part of the output product, it contributes mass or atoms to the output product. So you can't replace it with pure electricity. But what you can do is either use electricity to create green hydrogen, that is splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is enough to make ammonia with nitrogen, and then you have your fertilizers. In fact, that's how synthetic fertilizer is made today. It's just that we obtain the hydrogen from steam methane reforming, that is converting the methane and natural gas into hydrogen. So if you make the hydrogen a different way, from there on, it's the same process we already use. For some of the other chemicals, you'd need to combine the hydrogen with some captured carbon, which could be ideally from something like bioenergy combustion, to form methanol and then olefins and aromatics and the other chemicals that then go on downstream to produce the products. It's also possible to use bioenergy feedstocks. So it's a little iffy because it's tricky to have truly sustainable bioenergy. You have to have safeguards on land use change. You don't want to, if we start using more bioenergy here for feedstocks and it causes, and let's say wood pellets are traded internationally, you don't want it to cause deforestation somewhere else. But with the proper safeguards, it is possible to produce sustainable bioenergy, which is another way of producing chemical feedstocks. In fact, Brazil produces some of their chemicals from bioenergy today. So these are two of the better ways to produce chemicals without fossil fuel feedstocks.
It feels sort of just all of this in general as you're talking. I'm just in my mind, I'm imagining this giant jigsaw puzzle. It's like we have different pieces, like we have this technology here, we have this byproduct from this process here, and we just sort of have to figure out how to move all of the things around to get these processes to work together.
Yeah, the chemicals industry in particular can be like that because each reaction produces outputs, and then to the extent possible, the industry loves to use those as inputs into other reactions in downstream production chains. It can get very complex, but fortunately for us, a lot of the energy use and emissions are associated with what are a small number of chemicals, the petrochemicals. And by looking at how to get those without fossil fuels, we're addressing the vast majority of the emissions. And if you electrify heat, you get pretty much all the rest, apart from certain things like fluorinated gases, which I also discuss in the book. So the chemicals industry is probably the trickiest of them, but I do think it's very doable.
I appreciate that you brought up implementing some of those safeguards when it comes to things like biomass. I know that some policy when we started incentivizing things like ethanol, and the corn industry actually also impacted the production of palm oil overseas, which has impacted a lot of endangered species. So certainly thinking about it at a global scale seems very well worth it, especially for the chemical industry.
Absolutely. It is challenging to make sure that bioenergy is truly sustainable, even after considering these effects on international trade, right? Even if you guarantee that this specific plot of land is growing them in a sustainable way, that isn't the only thing you need to look at. And preventing the destruction of forests and key habitat anywhere in the world is an important goal.
Kind of piggybacking on that, that really relates to so much of the policy element of this. And when I was in college, I was an environmental studies major, so I did a lot of the environmental law and policy classes. And we talked about policy basically as a method of putting restrictions on the industry that then stimulated innovation. So, like asking them to reduce emissions by a certain amount would help stir technologies that might otherwise have barriers. The alternative argument, obviously, is that the market will drive what is the most important elements to production. As far as that goes, what areas do you think that policy is super necessary for pushing industry forward, and where do you think that maybe industry is already propelling itself just by the nature of the market?
It's a great question. So I think of policy as setting the landscape in which firms operate. So that can be restrictions, like you said, but it could also be financial incentives. It can be both carrots and sticks. So I think of it as just the policy sets up what do we as a society want to reward? How do we want our businesses to behave? Because they will try to maximize their profit, but that's how to do that depends on the rules of the game. And if the rules are set up so that we value things like protecting the environment and the rights of workers and public health for our communities, industry will respond to those policies that grant those protections. So I think policy is just central, just absolutely central to this question, because a lot of the things that industrial firms do are a step or two removed from the everyday lives of you and me. We don't see how our steel is being made. And so I think that setting up the right types of policy is the way to ensure that we have the products that are produced in the clean way that is good for the climate, that protects workers and communities. And then the right type of policy depends to some degree on the technological maturity of the specific approach or technology that you're looking at. For instance, when the clean method of producing something is very new, it may be higher cost because it's done at very small scale and they need to build the first ever commercial scale plant, say. So a policy like you can do a version of green public procurement, for instance. This is where, so government is a major buyer of certain industrial products like steel and cement because they're in public infrastructure like roads and bridges and public buildings. So government can just set aside, say, well, 5% of our steel purchases are going to go to clean primary steel made with, green hydrogen or electrolysis, some very new process like that. And that will give steelmakers the confidence they need to invest and build a new production line to produce steel this way because they know there's a market for it. They'll have a buyer. And then as it scales up, the price comes down. Government can ratchet up. Maybe it will then procure 10% and then 20% of its steel this way. And then they can start selling to the other buyers. Maybe auto companies want it where it only represents a tiny share of the cost of the vehicle. And it may help them sell cars to people who want to know that they were built with clean steel. So financial incentives like that, or just grants with cost sharing from the private sector, are useful at the early stages. Other policies are helpful later. One of the late stage policies, in my view, is carbon pricing. So that's like a carbon tax or a carbon cap and trade system. Sometimes an economist may say, oh, that's the only policy you need. But I don't agree with that. There's no one silver bullet policy. Carbon pricing is best when the clean technology option is mature and commercialized, and an industrial firm can then switch over to it by procuring clean equipment at reasonable cost. Because the goal isn't to have firms pay the carbon price. The goal is to have them switch to clean technology so that they don't pay the carbon price.
Right.
And if the clean technology isn't commercialized, they're just going to pay the carbon price and emit pollution anyway. So that's why it's a bit better fit for later in a technology's life cycle.
That's a great perspective on that I hadn't thought about it so wholly. I think also, just to piggyback off that last part of your answer, it also can box out smaller companies, which we don't want to necessarily incentivize only the largest players within a sector who can afford to play by the rules, to box out the smaller ones who can't necessarily. So I was wondering, as far as you're talking about one of the challenges about putting in policy, or at least a hesitation that maybe some politicians might have, being that it can make our domestic market less competitive, maybe with international players. And I was wondering if the US is really leading the charge or has the opportunity to lead the charge on these greener technology policies and industry, or if there are countries or areas of the world that we can look at as already leading the fight, and maybe we are already competing in their markets based on this greener technology.
I would say that Europe in the European Union, has been the leading area on this. They have some of the most aggressive, most ambitious targets regarding industrial decarbonization. And many countries in Europe have a number of helpful policies, and companies there have responded by setting up, specific dates and targets by which they expect to decarbonize. Some of the most interesting projects have happened there. For instance, in clean hydrogen-based steel, there's a couple projects in Sweden, Hybrid Initiative, a consortium of companies, as well as a company called H2 Green Steel. And these are all responding to the policy environment there, which includes something called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is getting at your question about competitiveness and leakage, the idea of companies offshoring their production rather than comply with the rules. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism essentially levels the playing field for domestic, in this case, European companies, where it says if you're importing a product from overseas, we'll look at its what's called embedded carbon, not literally embedded, but or embodied. It's how much was emitted in the course of producing that product. And then and then that can be taxed according to its carbon intensity to put it on an even footing with the domestic manufacturers in Europe that are subject to the European Emissions Trading System, ETS, carbon price. And similarly, it can rebate carbon fees to products that are being exported out of Europe to places without carbon pricing, so that European products are not at a disadvantage relative to other products competing in those markets. So it can go a long way toward leveling the playing field. You asked about the United States, and I would say that we are making amazing strides right now to catch up to Europe in these domains. Industrial decarbonization, for the first time, has become a real focus of policymakers, even just within the last year or so. There's been new funding for it through the Inflation Reduction Act, and offices within the U.S. Department of Energy that are spearheading both technical assistance and funding programs. None of those have leakage concerns because they are either giving out money or providing technical assistance, which doesn't raise the costs for any industrial firm. The leakage concerns come in with things like carbon pricing, where it could raise costs. There have been, I believe, 4 different proposals for carbon sensitive border tariffs for the United States. None has yet become law, but it's clearly something the United States is thinking about and thinking about aligning with Europe on that to help ensure the trade proceeds without tariffs. So I'm very optimistic about the direction we've been going here.
Love to hear that. Got to be optimistic. And it's nice to hear some genuine positive steps that are being taken right now. I do want to, right after I say got to be positive, I do want to ask a little bit about the flip side of this. I think whenever we talk about making a shift like this, people can tend to be a little bit hesitant, have some misgivings. Maybe it's related to, oh, well, what's that going to do to jobs? What's that going to do to costs that I have to pay, those types of things. But what do you think are maybe some common misunderstandings maybe that people might have about this transitioning to a zero carbon industry?
Well, one of the misconceptions we touched on already, which is that industry is too complex to regulate or incentivize. We can't understand what they're doing. You'd have to be an engineer who knows every process down to the finest detail. It's not true. A policymaker doesn't have to have 10 engineering degrees in order to create policy that is very effective at promoting clean industry and in a economically competitive way. And my book basically walks through how to do this. That's the core goal of the book, really, to explain the technologies and policies that can get us there. Another challenge is the one, or misconception is the one you mentioned about jobs. The notion that there's some competition here between the goals of transitioning to modern, high-tech, clean, sustainable industry and jobs and economic prosperity. In fact, this is making investments into clean industry, which is all this new machinery and investments into your workers, are some of the best investments the government or a country could possibly make. Not only do they create jobs directly through providing this equipment and training, but then that's new productive capital that then goes on to produce more value by producing more stuff more cleanly throughout the economy. It also will cut public health harms like heart disease and lung disease and strokes and heart attacks, all of which are made worse by air pollution. Not greenhouse gases in this case, but particulate matter and nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. And all of that, I mean, obviously there's a humanitarian reason to do that, but also it improves the economy if you have healthier people who are able to work more and need less medical care. And then there's the technological leadership angle. So these investments also help put a country at the forefront of all of these clean technologies, hydrogen and electrification, which are going to be the way that things are made increasingly and over the coming decades. And this transition has to happen because there's no way to stabilize climate, no way to stop global warming without addressing industrial emissions. Industry is a third of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, including purchased electricity. Disregarding electricity purchased by industry, it's still a quarter. It's a huge share. So it has to be addressed if we're not going to keep warming the planet forever, which is obviously unsustainable for humanity. So this is a shift that is already underway. It's going to continue. And investment in these technologies helps a country achieve this leadership, which makes its industries more competitive now and especially in the coming decades when this is going to be the way that things are produced. And there's additional revenues you can get, for example, from licensing that technology overseas. So there's lots of ways, everything from public health to direct construction jobs to securing the jobs for the future, that this is economically beneficial. This is really a win-win type of thing to do.
I really appreciate like the full spectrum of all the ways that you see this impacting things, because I do think that that's maybe the thing that we don't think about when we think about saving the environment is we're not just talking about an entity separate from how humans operate in a society and an economy. It's all tied together. You know, the climate is warming, and obviously every time we get a new climate report, we get more and more findings, more and more confirmation of what's going on. And we like to focus a lot on the optimism, because if you don't consciously look for the optimism in environmental problems, you will find plenty of pessimism. What do you think is the most important step that we can take right now outside of what's already being done? Like, what would you like to see if you could, have Congress pass one thing or one piece of policy really capture the public's attention? What would it be?
That's a tricky one because I very much feel like it, as I mentioned before, there's no one silver bullet policy.
Sure.
You really do need a portfolio of policies that target technologies at different maturity levels, and some are good for protecting communities and workers, and some are good for getting technologies out of the lab. And so it's very tough to settle on one. But I mentioned green public procurement. That's one of my favorites, but I already talked about it. So I'll pick a different one. Let's talk about green banks and lending mechanisms. So this is for sort of a middle, like the middle technological maturity. So for technologies that are out of the lab, they have a commercial prototype or a commercial version. They are ready to scale, but they're not yet large and produced in large quantities and dominant. So it can be hard for them to secure financing, meaning loans, to set up a new factory, buy machinery, get production underway. This technology may be still kind of new, still kind of unproven. Banks may charge high interest rates to lend out this money, and then that makes the product less competitive because they have to price it in a way that will let them pay back the loan at the higher interest rate. So one thing that government can do is set up an agency or a quasi-independent entity called a green bank. And it doesn't have to be a green bank. A government office could do the same things. But the point of it is to use some amount of government money to leverage private capital and make it available to these businesses at low cost. So they can use tools. They can use co-lending, so the government agrees to lend some money. They can use loan loss reserves or loan guarantees, which can say to the lender, look, if this technology doesn't work out and they declare bankruptcy or something, we'll cover some or all of the loss there. There's also bonds. So government can issue bonds, which are often tax favored, and then and the proceeds could be used to finance these projects. And all of these things get paid back. So these things are not expensive to government because government will, unlike, let's say, just a grant or a subsidy where there's no expectation that the money will be returned. These are tools to make low-cost financing available. So government can and sometimes does actually make money when using these tools, which they can then roll over and use to finance even more projects. So it's potentially sustainable after you initially capitalize a green bank without further government appropriations year after year, which makes it also more politically durable, because even if an administration comes in that doesn't have this as a priority, well, the green bank already has its money and can keep on using it and rolling it over. So these are some of the nice things about that policy approach. Great for those technologies that need to overcome that gap between early stage grants and lab funding and late stage private market funding without government help.
Yeah, an innovative idea. I feel like we don't always think about all of the ways that government can influence the landscape. Like, I mean, I brought it up basically solely in the context of restrictions, and you've already come up with several different alternative ways to look at it as a support mechanism for these new technologies. So I love that answer. That's awesome.
I love it too. And I truly do feel optimistic after having this conversation. The solutions are out there, they are achievable. And I know we have to wrap this up. I feel like we could do 10 episodes with you and we would learn so much and be able to get so much out of each one. But hopefully, at least for all of you listening, this was a good intro. And check out the book Zero Carbon Industry. You will get so much. It's described as a roadmap, and you talk in the book about achieving, and I don't even know if we clarified this, but you're talking about globally achieving zero carbon industry from 2050 to 2070. You talk a little bit about why you give that range in the book as well, but you do lay it out so nicely in terms of the big industry hitters, new technologies, policies, and even a more kind of complete specific roadmap. So it is all in there. We are so appreciative. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I learned a lot.
Absolutely.
Where can they find your book? How can they go about purchasing that? Instead of listening to 10 additional episodes, they can just read your book.
That's right. So you can head over to zerocarbonindustry.com. That website has more details about the book, links to where you can purchase it, and also a special 20% off discount code for your listeners. Again, that's zerocarbonindustry.com.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Definitely go check it out, folks. I know that I'm excited to finish it, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it more on the podcast too in future episodes. So, Jeffrey, for our listeners that listen to us regularly, they know we do try to end every episode with a little challenge of the week, challenge of the episode, to just a chance for our listeners to get involved in some way with the topic discussed. So would you be willing to give our listeners their challenge, any type of action that you would like to suggest for them, besides going to get your book, which we hope they do? Would you be willing to set them another challenge for this episode?
Absolutely. So I think I mentioned that I think the linchpin of decarbonizing industry is policy, getting policy that sets the landscape in which the industrial firms compete. And policy comes from us. It comes from you. It comes from policymakers that we elect. So my challenge is to get involved in that world of policy, whether that's finding a representative and volunteering for their campaign, or running for office yourself, or helping your friend do so. Even at every level of government, there are important choices to be made that impact industry, and green public procurement happens at local government levels as well as state and town and national. And there's many ways to influence policy, whether it's by volunteering or writing articles for the media and op-eds, or running oneself. So I would say feel empowered and explore ways that you can make a difference in how your town, your state, your country are governed.
Love that. Feel empowered, and don't sleep on your local government as well. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special episode, our interview with Jeffrey Rissman. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you could get a sense for the wealth of knowledge that he has I really do feel like we could do an entire podcast series with him and just learn so much. And if you're interested in learning more, definitely do check out his book, Zero Carbon Industry, at the website that he mentioned. We'll have that linked in our show notes for you to check out as well.
And he's right, there's a 20% off coupon at that link.
Woo!
So go check it out. Sarah, if folks have any sort of feedback, questions, ideas for other topics, where can they send that to us?
Best places to find us right now are you can find us on Facebook at A Little Greener Podcast, or you can send us an email at alittlegreenerpodcast@gmail.com. And we are always happy to hear from you.
Thank you all for listening, and we will talk to you in a couple weeks.
Bye.